Hereby, I open this academic ceremony at Maastricht University. First of all, I welcome Mr. Víctor Pablo Galván Chacón, and he will defend his thesis, Engineering Micro to Repair Macro, a materials-driven quest for bone regeneration. I welcome all the members of the degree committee, and in particular, your supervisor, Professor Pamela Habibovic, as he is Professor of Inorganic Biomaterials and affiliated with the Merlin Institute at Maastricht University. I will introduce the 5 opponents later during the opposition in the ceremony. And I welcome, of course, all the followers of the live stream. Mr. Galván Chacón, may I invite you to give a summary of your thesis. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Dear pro-rectors, dear members of the Corona, during the next, and dear family and friends, during the next 15 minutes, I will share my PhD work. First, I would like to start thinking about what do we know about bone. And usually we have like a very simplistic concept of what bone is and what bone does. Like for example, the Cambridge English Dictionary defines bone simply as one of the hard white pieces inside the body of a person or animal. If we go to the Oxford Dictionary, it says that it is any of the pieces of hard whitish tissue making up the skeletons of humans and other vertebrates. But on the other hand, bone is actually a very complex organ. It has a complex chemistry and nanostructure. It's composed of collagen fibrils aligned with nano-hydroxyapatite crystals. It also has different microstructures, such as the compact and the spongy bone. It has innervation and vascularization. And it is also populated by different cell types, such as the osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes. Bone has the capacity to regenerate itself, but that only happens when the defect is below a certain size. That is called the critical size bone defect. When we go over this size, bone needs some external help. And this is important because only in the USA and Europe alone per year, more than 500,000 patients require a surgery involving a bone graft substitute. This substitute can be obtained, for example, from autograft, which is tissue obtained from the same patient, allografts, tissue obtained from other humans, or xenografts, tissue obtained from animals. These alternatives have several disadvantages, such as the second site morbidity, the morbidity due to the second site surgery, the risk of disease transmission or immune reaction. But we also have synthetic biomaterials, and some of them have even received FDA approval. It can be NovaBone or more recently Magnetos. Calcium phosphates are actually already in the clinic, and they are available in many different shapes, like granules, powder, or injectables. And they have several advantages that make them very interesting for bone regeneration. First, they are easy and cheap to synthesize, meaning that we can reduce the burden on the healthcare system in terms of economy. They have long-term stability, and their chemical composition is similar to bone mineral, and that facilitates also the regulatory path towards clinical applications. And they can be biodegradable, osteoconductive, and even osteoinductive. But still, today, their performance is considered inferior to autologous bone, to the autograft. And what do we know about the performance of calcium phosphate is that it depends on the material properties. This way, for example, the presence of bioinorganics can trigger the differentiation towards the osteogenic lineage, and the surface roughness is known to affect, for example, cell morphology or the protein addition. Therefore, it is really important to know what is the exact role of each material property into the bioactivity of the calcium phosphate. And this is difficult to achieve because these properties are not independent, they are intertwined. For example, if we change the chemical properties of a calcium phosphate by incorporating an ion into the lattice, it can be a bioinorganic like magnesium or strontium, it will not only change the chemical properties, but it will also affect the structural properties, for example, the roughness of the surface. We can see this in this example in which 3 calcium phosphates were synthesized with increasing levels of magnesium. And as you can see, it also affected the microstructure of the material. So the first thing we did during this thesis was actually to review what strategies were out there to decouple the influence of material properties. One of them was to coat the ceramics with a thin metal layer, therefore keeping the structural properties but changing the surface chemistry. Also, the use of porogens allowed to introduce pores in a controlled way with controlled size. We can go and replicate the original structure of the crystals in an analog in polymer, and in that way we also keep the structural properties but with a different chemistry. And we can design composite materials with totally different structural properties, but some of the chemical cues, like for example, calcium or phosphate salts. So in this thesis, our approach was to bring technologies from other fields to the calcium phosphate fields. And these technologies, for example, the microfabrication in chapter 3, bioinformatics in chapter 4, microfluidics, chapter 5, and organ-on-a-chip technologies that equal a combination of microfluidics and microfabrication in chapter 6. So in chapter 3, actually, we wanted to replicate the calcium phosphate microstructure and chemical cues and use this as a tool to decouple the roles of chemistry and microstructure. We started with a disk of calcium phosphate, tricalcium phosphate, and using a combination of embossing and soft lithography, we produced materials with the same structure, but in a different material, like polystyrene, polylactic acid, and polylactic acid composites containing some of the chemical cues of the original ceramic, like calcium salt, phosphate salt, or the original TCP powder. Actually, this technique works really well, and as you can see here, you can actually replicate even the smallest and finest details down to some micrometer level. Next, we sieved cells, HMSCs, and we look for the expression of osteogenic differentiation markers. And what our results tell us is that the best material in inducing osteogenic differentiation was the original TCP ceramic, and the second one was the one that combined the microstructure of the ceramic with the calcium salt. Well, from here we can obtain 2 conclusions. One is that as the TCP ceramic was the best one, with our replicas we not managed to introduce all the physicochemical cues that actually make the material so good for bone regeneration. And the second conclusion is that the combination of microstructure and chemistry was the most potent after the original ceramic. But we should realize 2 other things. That is that with decoupling strategies, you are limited to a certain number of properties that you can decouple simultaneously, and also that possible synergistic effects are lost due to the use precisely of this decoupling strategy. Therefore, in the next chapter, we changed the tools that we used to achieve our goal. We had 6 different calcium phosphate ceramics, 2 hydroxyapatites, 2 tricalcium phosphates, and 2 biphasic phosphate ceramics. And we wanted to correlate all the possible material properties with the gene expression at transcriptomic level. For that, we used bioinformatic tools, and in our tools, the input was numerical parameters describing the material properties, and the output was actually the gene expression, looking for genes, for example, for cell differentiation or the formation of the cytoskeleton. We started this with a very comprehensive material characterization. We analyzed the crystal structure by XRD and refinement. We look at the ion composition of the particles themselves and also the release of ions in medium. We look at the pore size and pore size distribution. And we also have a look at the 3D structure using micro-CT, and we obtain information like the interconnectivity of the pores, for example. And we also look at the microstructure using electron microscopy, and we characterize the surface roughness as well using confocal profilometry. Once we have that, we use this to correlate to transcriptomic data. And actually, we found a very high number of correlations, most of which are already described in the literature. For example, looking at the structural parameters, many of them have a high number of correlations with the cytoskeleton, which is something logical, as I explained before. For example, the surface roughness affects the cell morphology of the cells seated on the material. On the next chapter, actually, we move from obtaining knowledge about calcium phosphate to produce calcium phosphate microparticles. The way we did that was to create microfluidic chips able to produce droplets and loaded with the calcium phosphate precursors. And when these droplets were immersed in ammonia, the calcium phosphate microparticles will precipitate. The reason for doing this is that the droplets that are produced in this kind of devices are totally homogeneous, and therefore each of them acts as a microreactor. And the result materials are extremely homogeneous as well. So we started doing simulations of many different designs to obtain something optimal. And then some of these designs were used to create actually our prototype. That was done in photolithography, and later using soft lithography transferred to PDMS. We tested the devices, and we saw that we will control the droplet size very finely. And also we observed something interesting, that is that we could see the particle formation using just a bright field microscope. And we could obtain also some information about the kinetics of the reaction, how fast it was the particle forming. The goal of this was to produce materials that stimulate osteogenic differentiation. We produced 4 different materials, and we seeded cells on them. We saw that actually the materials, they form focal adhesions, with the cells form focal adhesion with the materials, sorry. And also we analyzed the DNA, the proliferation, metabolic activity, alkaline phosphatase expression, and also we did PCR for the expression of some osteogenic genes. And our conclusion is that these particles actually promote the expression of osteogenic genes. In the last chapter, we wanted to create an on-chip model of trabecular bone. We did that by starting with nano CT scans that we converted into a 3D model suitable for printing. And we did the printing using 2-photon lithography. In this technique, the materials are produced usually in an acrylic photopolymer, which have a chemistry that is quite far from the chemistry of bone. And to introduce some of the chemical features of bone, we did an enzymatic coating on the materials, and we deposit a very thin layer of calcium phosphate on top of this material without affecting significantly the structural properties. We also designed a microfluidic chip able to contain up to 6 scaffolds. We produce the device again using photolithography. We assemble it, and then we seed cells on it. Our results point that this to the fact that this is a valid on-chip platform to study bone regeneration. We have very high cell viability up to day 21. We have extensive ECM, like you can see in this electron microscope image, and collagen production, like you can see in the bottom one. And in the coated scaffolds, we also saw the production of something that we believe to be bone nodules. As I said, these only appear in the coated scaffolds. So now coming to the conclusions. First, we use this microfabrication technology to produce replicas of the original material, and our results point to a combined effect of the chemistry and the microstructure in promoting osteogenic differentiation. Later, we use informatic tools, and with this, actually, we overcome some of the limitations of the previous approach, where well, we could only decouple a few properties at the same time, and here we managed to decouple dozens of them. And we obtain predictions that actually are, most of them, in accordance with what is published in the literature. Then, using the droplet microfluidic platform, we managed to find a way to produce particles with controlled chemistry, structure, and size. And the last one was the production of the bone on a chip. And we believe that this is a valid platform for studying bone regeneration and to develop new biomaterials. And well, the overall conclusion of the thesis is that we demonstrated that developing and using combinations of tools from different fields like material science, microtechnology, microfabrication, microfluidics, or bioinformatics allowed to gain further insight into the mechanisms governing the calcium phosphate bioactivity. I would like to acknowledge, well, first my supervisor, my co-authors, my 3 students, the IB and Berlin colleagues, family and friends, and especially, well, Daniel, Dani, Jasia, David, and Federica, who helped me with this in preparing for this presentation. And also, well, the people that funded the research, the Promise of Limburg and Materials-Driven Regeneration, and the others that provided help in other ways. Thank you for your attention. Now I give the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Galván Chacón. The opposition will now be opened by the chair of the Thesis Assessment Committee, Professor Roman Trockenmüller. He is Professor of Microtissue Engineering at Maastricht University, and he is affiliated with the Merlin Institute. Professor Trockenmüller.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, let me first congratulate you on this wonderful thesis, which I enjoyed very much reading, particularly the part on the droplet microfluidics as a tool for the production of the calcium phosphate microparticles. Let me and us go straight to the questions. My first question concerns chapter 2, and for the audience, I'm interested in page 24. There you describe or discuss that it should be mentioned that the use of line-of-sight coating methods, for example, that means methods in which only surfaces that are exposed to the source of the coating material, such as plasma spraying or most physical vapor deposition techniques, have an important disadvantage of leaving some areas uncoated. And my question to you would now be, do you know of some methods, for example, physical vapor deposition methods, to avoid these shadowing effects and improve, for example, the coverage of sidewalls of your biomimetic topography? Do you know some methods how that can be avoided?
So, my highly esteemed opponent, first, I would like to thank you for your kind words about my thesis. Yeah, actually, that is something that we discussed on chapter 2, and it's something that we kept in mind when we were going in chapter 6 with the bone on a chip. With this bone on a chip, actually, we started with a line-of-sight method. It was the spattering, the ultrasound spattering of hydroxyapatite. And what we saw is that indeed it was only on the surface of the scaffold, and it was not getting inside the pores. So, for example, one method that we applied was the use of this enzymatic coating. The solution go inside the pores, and we could see like the position there. In the case of vertical walls, I am not so sure how much it will adhere, but we also saw that it was coated or at least partially coated.
Thank you very much. I might maybe a little bit still stay on this very item here, on this question. If you would use these very directional methods, you still could imagine how one would improve. So you mentioned already sputtering. Maybe if you recall what maybe in the Merlin clean rooms, how maybe you can describe to the audience what was the approach there, at least to improve the distribution of material. Maybe not deep inside a porous construct, but maybe at least at the outer, that all surfaces are. Do you recall how that configuration was in that machine?
Well, I think you are talking about the coater that we have for producing the lithography. Is it correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so in this case, well, that was done for SU8 molds, but in this case, what you do is that on a perfectly flat surface, you put the silicon wafer, and then you pour the SU8, that is the resin, and then it spins, it's a spin coater, and the layer that you obtain is well, perfectly smooth in the case of the silicon wafers. Still, that will work for the top surface, let's say, of the material, but I'm not so sure about how well that will work for the pores.
May I still guide and help us all a little bit? If you open that device, do you recall how the so-called targets, so that is the material you know, of choice which you want to deposit, how they were mounted in that device? Have there been kind of, in terms of the axis of sputtering, was that kind of straight or perpendicular to the subset plane?
Well, it's perpendicular, I think.
So what we have in the clean room was not exactly perpendicular. So that was out of axis and was inclined. And maybe can you imagine, so if you have a kind of, an inclined sputtering more from the side, what additionally would maybe do with your subset? Would you leave that statically, or would you also do something there to have all-sided coverage?
Okay, I think you were referring to the sputter coater that we have on the left. Okay, I thought it was the other one. Yeah, indeed, you keep it inclined and then you rotate, if I am correct. Yes.
Yes, so that could help us in maybe at least, but I understand what you mean. For deeper insight, we would need other solutions. My next question would be still on chapter 2, page 27. You mentioned polishing as just as a solution, obviously, to create to cancel like out to that extent as that is possible, like surface roughness to come to smooth surfaces. And you mentioned when we would do this, we would also change the grain size. How can that be explained? Because that material, I would not even think it's possible to deform the crystals as maybe with ductile, with a metal. How would you change the grain size of a ceramic if you polish the surface?
Well, I think that the mechanical modification will actually remove part of the material, and then the grains that are on the surface, they will be maybe smaller, because of the mechanical modification that you are doing. So
what you're saying, that's actually what I put here as a potential answer also, that we are not talking about grains getting bigger by polishing, but just that you expose grains which are just lying deeper. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yes, oh, that's an excellent answer. That is actually what I put here as a potential one. That seems also quite likely to me, or the only possible explanation. And then maybe because there is maybe only 1 minute, very briefly, you used the droplet generator, well, for the generation of the droplets. Can you do more on chips? So maybe the precipitation, for very good reason, which I very well understand, it was done off chip. But could you just in 1 minute maybe briefly sketch if even the precipitation, maybe even the separation from the oil or the cell culture could be also all done in droplets? Would you think one day that is possible? Even if there are different timings, you know, certain fluids stay longer in one chamber. Some chambers would have to be considerably bigger. You had well plates for the precipitation and so on.
Well, actually, that is indeed a very interesting question. And we were working on chips that produce inline, what we call inline mineralization. So there were chips in which you had a central chamber, and then in that chamber, the droplets arrive, and on parallel channels, you will have the flow of ammonia that will diffuse towards the center. And in that way, well, the particles will precipitate inside, and that opens the door right to potentially further process the particles, like removing the oil, incorporating the cyclohexane and the acetone later. And then just moving to another chamber, you could potentially do the cell culture in the same device.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Mr. Prorector, my answers were kind of in a very satisfactory manner answered, and I would like to give the word back to you. Thank you.
Unmute, please.
I forgot. And now I'm unmuted. The next opponent is Professor Maria João Ginebra. She is Professor of Materials Science and Engineering, and she is affiliated with the Biomedical Engineering Research Center of the Technical University of Catalonia in Spain. Professor Ginebra.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to be part of this jury. I have read with great interest the doctoral thesis, and indeed I have enjoyed it a lot. I think that you have done a great job, and I want to congratulate you for it. The thesis is very well structured and very well written in a very concise and clear style. And before going to the questions, I wanted also to tell you that I have the impression that you have been very lucky to have this opportunity for three reasons. First, you have had the opportunity to work in a very young and very dynamic group and institute that is at the forefront of its field. Second, you have had also the opportunity to undertake like different expeditions to explore very innovative approaches and breaking new ground in a field, that of calcium phosphate, that in your own words is a bit old-fashioned. And you have also been able to touch many cutting-edge techniques and conventional in the field of bioceramics or even biomaterials in general. So I think that for these three reasons, you have to be very happy to have had this opportunity in the past years doing the PhD in this environment. And now I will go to my questions. My first question goes to chapter 3, where you do a very nice work decoupling the role of chemistry and microstructure of calcium phosphate substrates and composites. And one of the limitations that you acknowledge is that in that study it was difficult to control the release of calcium and phosphate ions from the composite that you prepared. My question is, did you try to solve this problem? Or if not, did you have, or do you have now some ideas on how this could be solved?
Well, my highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your words about my thesis and also about the institute. That was indeed an institute that, well, there are not many around there where you can do such multidisciplinary research, and also in such a multicultural and nice environment. That was totally true. Then regarding your question, it is true that the release was not properly controlled. When we started this study, actually we used the same polymer that was used in a previous study, in which instead of disc, they use porous particles. And well, we kind of assumed that we will have a release that was similar to that one. Instead of that, we have a burst release of phosphate, and the calcium, either we didn't have the release or we missed the peak. Particularly, I think that we missed the peak in the time point. In the future, yeah, indeed, what we will need to do is to control this better before starting the cell culture experiments. Maybe selecting a different molecular weight for the polymer, for the PLA, or also having a look at how the porous structure affects this release.
Okay. Thank you. Then moving to chapter 6, so a big jump to the chapter devoted to bone on a chip. I found it very interesting and very innovative. But I was a little bit, and I wanted to ask you a kind of philosophical question. I was a little bit surprised that you tried to create a model for trabecular bone to assess it in this bone on a chip platform. Because trabecular bone, in fact, is a 3D structure where let's say the architectural parameters are quite large. In fact, the size of the trabeculae of bone can be hundreds of microns. And the material that you prepared, the bone model that you had was, if I'm not wrong, 800 by 800 by 100 microns thick only. So it was very, very thin. So my question is, do you think that this model could be, or this strategy could be applied for larger samples or thicker samples that are able to capture better, perhaps, the architecture of trabecular bone, or you have a limitation in terms of thickness?
Thank you for your question. Indeed, there is a limitation for the thickness. If I am correct, in this device, two-photon polymerization, the nanoscribe, this is 500 micrometers in height. And actually, at the beginning, in pre-experiments, let's say, we printed the scaffolds up to 500 nanometers. But in the end, 2PP is a very slow technique. So we decided to reduce the size of the scaffold to be able to produce a sufficient number of samples for the experiment. But indeed, the trabecular bone is a truly 3D structure. In our case, well, it was perhaps not thick enough. 100 micrometers allow us to have some pores and some interconnected pores, and that was the goal.
And did you have interconnected porosity in your samples, or it was just a kind of 2.5D, as you say in another chapter? So it's a real 3D where you have a fluid flow inside your structure?
Yeah, in some of the pores we have that, and actually in the simulations you can see that there is flow through the pores.
Through the pore. Okay.
Not all of them, but yes.
Some of them. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I had also a curiosity regarding this chapter about the coating that you produced on this polymer. You used an enzymatic method. Why did you select this? Or you have discussed before with Professor Druckenmüller about other techniques, but for instance, could have you? I was surprised why you didn't use, for instance, a more conventional method like the Kokubo method, where you have just inorganic components, and why did you go through this other way? Is there any reason?
Well, just the reason actually is that we thought that this method actually we knew that this method could provide like a very, very thin layer, because the pH is increasing like very, very slowly. And in the end, well, the thickness of the layer actually in the characterization of the surface roughness that we did by confocal profilometry, it didn't change significantly. So for us, it was ideal actually to do it, because you have a very, very thin layer and you don't modify the microstructure.
So it allows to have thinner layers than other.
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And regarding the conditions of the culture that you did in this bone on a chip platform, you applied a flow rate that was somehow you just tried one, right? Mm-hmm. How was this selected, and did you play also around with this parameter, or was something prefixed?
Actually, we selected that doing a sort of literature search to see what was the flow in trabecular bone. I have to say that there are not many papers there, and the flow that we selected, I think it was measured through Doppler ultrasound. So maybe it's not the best, but it was, in my opinion, the most accurate value that we could obtain.
Okay. Thank you.
And about playing with the flow, actually, that is something that will be very interesting for the future, because well, the CR stress can also affect the how the cells behave.
Of course, yeah. And regarding the, did you do also some comparison with flat surfaces, or you just went directly to this trabecular bone model?
Directly to the model.
Yeah. Do you think it could add something to also compare to what happened if you culture the cells in flat surfaces?
You may give a short answer, please.
Most likely, well, the cell morphology will probably change, and we don't know if the cell attachment will be the same.
Okay, so thank you very much, dear candidate. I appreciate your answers.
Thank you, Professor Ginebra. The next opponent is Dr. Florence Barrère de Groot, and she is Head of Development with expertise in calcium phosphates at Kudos Biosciences Limited. Professor de Groot.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, I will try to make my compliment short because I cannot agree more than what has been said by the previous chairman and opponent. I really enjoyed very much this work, and I really appreciated the very systematic, old-fashioned way of characterization of the material and the systematic way to address all the material's property in a very classical, nice way, and also all the new techniques that you have been approaching and trying to solve new problems and analyzing all these results with the most modern techniques. So really congratulations to you, to your supervisor, and all your co-authors and stagiaires who worked under your supervision. Really good work. I'm old-fashioned. I did the biomimetic coating using a Kogupo solution. And the chapter that caught my biggest attention was chapter 5, how you synthesize this beautiful droplet. It's really, really interesting, and you can control the size. It's really elegant because the precipitation occurs when you apply this basic solution to change the pH. You clean, you dry, and you characterize perfectly well this type of granules. But I was intrigued by the SEM images that you provided, page 159, figure 5. And you have microporous materials. This is something that I'm used to see. I mean, not that spherical, but it's quite comparable to the TCP figure that you showed in the supplement pictures, supplementary figure 1, page 174. And I do not have any answer how this microporous structure is formed in your droplet system. Do you have an idea?
Well, my esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words about my thesis. Well, regarding the formation of the pores, actually what we saw when we look at the formation of the particles, as I said, through bright field microscopy, is that they are kind of formed by aggregation of probably nanopowder. So these start from the center, and these start forming aggregation around. And in that process, I think that the micropores are created.
Yes, but if I think of the, well, nucleation and growth on coatings, what we see when they aggregate, I mean, we see globules, but not so much the space between globules. So here we have really, we see really empty pores.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in the strontium sample, yeah, that is the case. But what we observe, because actually we repeated many times the experiments about the kinetics and for all the materials, is that indeed it grows like that in a small, it starts in the center and then like globules around.
Yeah. And why aren't they more compact then?
Well, that is something that I don't know the answer. If we increase the concentration of the reactants, they will be completely compact. But for the concentrations that we use in the experiment, they were a bit porous.
Okay. And so did you try different concentrations, or was the goal to create particles looking like microporous ceramics, or it was just a nice surprise?
No, actually, also in the figure 5B, you see that we tried different porosities with different concentrations, and well, we decided to go for the middle one that we tried, because indeed it had some microporosity that could be good for the cells. It will be probably better than the compact materials.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, candidate. Well, I will stay on this figure 5. I read in your discussion of related to this technique that you can control the size, the composition, the monodispersity of this type of materials. And also, I mean, you emphasize also in your presentation that this technique offers particles which are totally homogeneous, extremely homogeneous. But I see a wonderful, huge nanorod on the calcium phosphate ratio 1.5, growing. And you even made a higher magnification of this one. So do you still believe that the composition is highly homogeneous? And how this nanorod formed?
Oh, that is a good question indeed. In this case, the XRD analysis was saying that it was pure hydroxyapatite. It can be, of course, that one droplet was not of the same composition. That could happen if there is some instability in the flow. But in general, I think that they were all the same kind of particles. I don't know about that kind of hexagonal rod. I don't know the reason.
Okay, so you selected this picture, but it's not representative of the spheres that you observed in general.
It was randomly selected. So.
Okay, well, that's nice to see. Did you look at other SEM images of precipitated calcium phosphate? Because sometimes I can imagine there are no techniques to characterize precisely what type of crystal this is. But do you have any idea how you could characterize this crystal biome?
Well, not really. There are other techniques such as the transmission electron microscope, but that actually has a limit in the, I think, hundreds of nanometers range. Thicker than that, we will not get it. We did try to characterize actually the small powder that is almost like we were saying, the aggregates, they were like much smaller than micrometer size. And we did try to characterize that using the transmission electron microscope in the diffraction mode, but we didn't. The sample was still too thick for the X-ray to pass through it. So we did not get useful information on that in our case. And I don't know other techniques that could be used.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm satisfied with the answers. I would have loved to have much more, but time is up. So thank you very much, dear candidate.
Thank you, Professor De Groot. The next opponent is Professor Poeze. He is Professor of Surgery, and in particular trauma surgery at Maastricht University, and he's affiliated with the Maastricht University Medical Center at the Department of Surgery. Professor Poeze.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, First of all, I would like to congratulate you on your achievements, producing such an extensive and high-value thesis. I've read it with much interest, even as a clinician. And of course, as you might have guessed, I tried to translate your results to clinical practice. But before I start with the discussion, of course, I want to include your supervisor and promoter in the applause to your achievements. My first one is, can you read out loud proposition number 9?
Sure. Well, first, my highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your words of my thesis, and I will proceed now to read the proposition. Wealth was an inferior object, but what glory will attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death. And this is from the original Frankenstein by Mary Shelley.
All right, thank you. What would you like to defend with this proposition?
Well, actually, this is a proposition that I decided to include, I would say, several years ago when I was starting the PhD and not now. And I think that the meaning that I want to transmit was that many times, especially in our kind of applied field, we go into creating a scheme of companies, into trying to make profit of what we are developing. And while that is actually useful and totally necessary to bring products to the market, we should not lose from the aim of actually improving human health, even if it is not that profitable in some cases.
Well, thank you very much for that. So I can imagine that you are aiming with your thesis to addressing that issue. So in your introduction, you described the clinical translation actually, and that you perform all these studies because of the increase in aging population. And you also increase you indicate the increase in the number of bone repair surgeries. For this reason, you have studied the microfabrication of these different compositions of calcium phosphate ceramic scaffolds in chapter 3, and the interaction with cell cultures to improve the osteogenic potential of your mesenchymal stem cells. I would like to challenge you a little bit on discussing on your end target, actually, your mesenchymal stem cells, because you use a healthy donor. Why did you choose that as a end target of your composition?
Thank you for your question. You mean why I use a healthy donor instead of a donor with some problems? Or?
Yes, exactly. So have you ever looked, or did you consider choosing a stem cell from a population of elderly healthy donors, or even a patient with a bone defect? So would there be a difference in your readout of osteogenic potential if you use this different composition of your scaffolds?
Well, yeah, that indeed is a question that gives some debate. We use the healthy donors, I think, because that is the standard in our field, in the in vitro experiments. But we also thought, I believe that was in chapter 6, about using future projects, right? But using cells obtained from patients, elderly patients with osteoporosis. And indeed, it will be a very interesting comparison between what happens in our case, well, in chapter 6, what happens with the production of collagen, for example, between the healthy donor and the donor with osteoporosis. And that is something that probably needs to be done more often in research.
So you're agreeing with me that there is a difference between your end targets depending on what kind of patient you or healthy person you're getting your samples from?
Yes.
Yes. So why only use one patient or one healthy donor? Because if there is a difference between populations, then the use of a considerable, I would say, a sample-sized calculated number of healthy donors or patients, wouldn't that not be producing more reliable results in the end?
Indeed, and naturally on chapter 5, we did use 2 donors. But on chapter 3, well, due to the long time that the production of these samples was taken, because it was months of having 2 people working continuously producing the samples, we only went for 1 donor. Also because the number of cells for such a number of samples is quite high. So it also requires some effort in the cell culture part.
So I totally agree with you that it is a major effort. But would that have changed in your estimation your end results on the different composition of the ceramic scaffolds?
That will have to happen indeed, yes.
Okay, all right. So my patients usually don't have a optimal condition in nutritional wise or the surrounding conditions of the cells itself. That is the essence, I think, of having a bone defect. So would changing the environment in which you culture your mesenchymal stem cells in the different ceramic coating surroundings have changed the results of your studies?
Yes, definitely, because the kind of nutrients and the amount of nutrients that you have definitely will affect the cell function, the metabolism, and everything else. So the end results will also change.
So would that make it more clinical translatable, or is that too far-fetched? These areas are too far abroad to each other at this moment?
Well, I don't think they are too far. I think it depends also on what kind of experiments you are doing and how you are planning it. Because if you want to have something widely comparable to the studies out there, you will go for probably 2 or 3 healthy donors, and that is what you will do. But indeed, we will probably need to change the way that these experiments are done to include some pathological conditions.
Am I allowed to ask one more short question then? Short question. In chapter 6, you have a very nice additional step into a translational model using your bone on the chip model, and you use a continuous flow. As you might know that bone cells are constantly changing to different shear stresses, and perhaps that it can be induced by different flow conditions. Have you considered that to execute in your model, to use different flow types or intermittent flow types as a model for inducing shear stress, because the mesenchymal stem cells will react to different types of shear stress?
Well, indeed, they will react to the different shear stresses. What we consider was something actually that in the end will provide something similar, maybe. That is the use of more elastic materials, like ideally mineralized collagen, which is a bit elastic, and then to have some mechanical actuators that in the end it will be kind of the same. But of course, playing with the flow in the model is something that still needs to be done.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your answers. I'm satisfied with that, and give the word back to the prorector. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Poese. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Aurélie Carlier, and she is Assistant Professor in Computational Modeling at Merlin Institute, Maastricht University.
Thank you for the introduction. And dear candidates, also from my side, I would like to congratulate you on the very interdisciplinary, let's say, the very interdisciplinary thesis, especially also, of course, chapter 4, which you can imagine I enjoyed very much, with all the different computational techniques and correlation between those, and a very nice presentation. Now, I would actually like to start with a question that stems from your proposition 1. So would you be willing to read that, please?
Yes, well, my esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words about my thesis. I will now read the proposition. Understanding the role of individual material properties in the biological response to a calcium phosphate graft substitute is imperative for improving its clinical performance.
Thank you. Well, I would like to discuss a bit about that, because also in your presentation, you alluded to the fact that if you decouple these things, that the synergistic effects are lost, and that you can actually decouple a limited amount of properties, and you cannot decouple them anyway in the production process. So if it works, then it works. So why is there actually, is it essential to know the effect of the individual properties?
Actually, that is a good philosophical question. I like. Indeed, like in previous years and previous research, the approach was just kind of trial and error or based on educated guess. And well, we can see in research that we have produced successful calcium phosphate materials. But by using this kind of decoupling strategies, by using like this combination of tools, what we want actually is to accelerate the process of gaining knowledge about calcium phosphate ceramics. And in the end, what we would like to have is just we know exactly how each material property affects each biological response, and that way we can fabricate or try to fabricate a ceramic that is close to the ideal properties.
Okay, and following up on that a bit, so because some of these properties, of course, influence each other. The dissolution rate is influenced by the chemistry, by the porosity. So would it then make more sense to capture these in one lumped parameter? Did you see that also coming back in your results?
We observed in the pre-treatment of the data that we had many correlations, because we started with, I believe, 186 parameters. And the first thing that we did was to look which parameters had like very, very strong correlations, I mean material parameters between them. And then out of there, we reduced the number of parameters because it was no sense in having two parameters that vary in the same way to, I believe, 76. So indeed, we had to do a reduction of the data.
And does it then also make sense that if you would characterize these biomaterials, which you actually did very extensively, to then also focus on that limited set? Or would you nevertheless always characterize all the properties, even though they are correlated?
Well, maybe in terms of efficiency will be the same, because, well, from one technique, you can obtain multiple parameters. And in the end, to obtain one or two of them, you will have to perform the same experiment. So I will continue doing the same.
Okay. Yeah, then another aspect that I would like to discuss with you, and you touch upon this in various places in your thesis, is that that there is actually a requirement for more standardization, both on the material side as well as on the biology side, let's say. And so, yeah, could you comment on why there is this lack of consensus and standards, and what is actually missing? Which steps do we need to take?
Yes, indeed, we mentioned that several times in the thesis. And the reason is that when you, especially when you do like a review paper, like it was our case, you try to compare studies, and you try to compare both, let's say, the material characterization part and the biological output. And I think from around 500 papers that I read for that review, we selected around 100, because in many of them it was impossible to establish a comparison between the results, both, as I said, in material characterization and in the other part. On the other hand, it is difficult sometimes to obtain, let's say, common parameters between different kinds of biomaterials. For calcium phosphate, it is easier, but if you go towards titanium biomaterials, you, for example, cannot use the phase composition of hydroxyapatite and everything, because you will have all a different crystal structure. So you need to come up with parameters that are common, and most of these parameters that can be used are actually structural parameters.
Okay, and so regarding that, do you feel that if others have used, for example, other methodologies or other standards, let's say, measurements do you think that this would influence, let's say, this correlations that you're trying to make between structure and or properties and the biological outcome?
It might influence, but in general, the material characterization techniques, they are usually done in a complementary way. So usually when you do XRD, you also do FTIR to look at the functional groups. And even if you go for another technique, in the end, you should get similar information or comparable information.
So you feel that in that sense, to standardize the field, most effort should go towards, let's say, the biological side to standardize those experiments and not so much the material characterization. Can I conclude from that?
Well, I would say that we need to standardize both parts, both materials and the biological output. But indeed, there is more variety in the biological output.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe to end with is that, I'm looking for my question. Yes, so in your PhD, you worked actually on decoupling, the properties, on developing new methods, and also making a bone-on-chip device. And of course, in all of these areas, further developments can be needed or can be improved. Now, which one of these would you tackle first and why?
I mean, the challenges. Maybe the one that will be closer to a clinical application might be the bone-on-chip. And I will try to use that well to evaluate different biomaterials. And also, like I proposed in the thesis, for example, as a way of evaluating bone defects, what is the critical size in vitro. So I think that is something that can be translated to the clinic, let's say to the pre-clinic, like to use cells from the own patient and go also towards personalized medicine.
Okay, can I ask one more question? Or yes, so maybe following up on that. So for the bone-on-chip, you would make it more complex based on the biology, but not so much on the material side then?
Well, on the material side, we still need to do some improvements. So we will have to, for example, replace the acrylic photopolymer by collagen or other biomaterials.
I'm quite sure that you have noticed that the time for defending your thesis has passed. The committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And please await our return with the results of our deliberation.
Thank you.
Mr. Víctor Pablo Galván Chacón. The degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense, and in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Habibovic is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch University custom and law. I invite her now to take the floor. Professor Habibovic.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
What is your answer to this question?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Víctor Pablo Galván Chacón, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor, affixed by the official seal of the university, shown by the beadle now.
Okay.
Well, now I can take over and do the best part of the thesis, because it means that it's the end. Dear Victor, the big moment has come. You can officially call yourself Dr. Galván Chacón now, or I should say it, Dr. Victor. Your PhD degree is a reward for many years of hard work, successes and failures, days with bad mood and days with triumphs. Exactly what a PhD trajectory should be. Something people often do not know about doing a PhD is the enormous effort you have to put in staying motivated. You may recall the warning I gave you when you applied for this position. I said, it will be the time when you will meet many people and make new friends, but also at the same time, the time when you may feel very, very lonely, because your PhD project means everything to you, but it is just another PhD project for everyone else. And yet, you accepted the challenge. Your trajectory started quite some time ago, in 2014. I found back your application letter that started with, I completed my bachelor studies in physics, but from the beginning, I had been interested in application of science and technology to the human health. So I enrolled in a 2-year master's degree in biomedical engineering. And then I admit that I am not familiar with certain techniques usually required in bone tissue engineering, such as cell culturing, but I'm willing to learn them. Now, this application letter is typical for how I have got to know you, Victor. Having a clear goal, being honest and eager to learn. The start of your PhD project was not an easy one. This was the time when we as a group decided to move from the University of Twente to Maastricht University, and you, together with your buddy Danielle, your paranym today, one of them, were among the first real Merlin students. While one could see this as an advantage, we both know that there were also many, many disadvantages. Labs needed to be renovated, a project that took much longer than expected, everything had to be restarted and validated, etc., etc. The word pioneering got a completely new dimension for you. But you kept up a good spirit, took things step by step, with some size, I must admit, and started doing experiments as fast as you could. And this situation by no means prevented you from being ambitious. We had a clear idea for your project, which was to try to disentangle properties of calcium phosphate ceramics to get a better insight in their effect on their bone regenerative potential. I gave you the freedom to use your creativity to decide which tools and methods to go for. And after many discussions with Danielle, but also with one of your other good friends, David Barata, who I'm sure is online with us today as well, you decided not to decide, but to use them all. Indeed, microfluidics, materials characterization techniques, bioinformatics, cell culture, and biological assays, you decided to use them all. In addition, you wanted to learn and to do it all yourself. And so physicists with master's degree in biomedical engineering and without knowledge of methods like cell culture became a bit of everything. A chemist, a material scientist, expert in micro and nanotech, and even a bit of a biologist, although we were always joking that we would not say this last thing too loudly. Now, the effort you have spent in learning and using these different methods is well reflected in your thesis. You clearly approach the challenge of understanding the beauty and the power of calcium phosphates, and I know that there are at least 2 committee members who will fully agree with me on this statement, from many different perspectives, all of which was a high quality and interesting enough to be published in 1 review and 4, well, almost the 5th published research paper in highly respected journals in the field, a result to be proud of. Important to mention is the fact that although you wanted to learn and do everything yourself, this did not stop you from building an extensive network of collaborators inside and outside Maastricht University, many of whom are co-authors on your papers. You were also always willing to help your colleagues, and not only with the things you were familiar with, but especially with the first creative part of developing new ideas. I'm sure many of your colleagues are grateful to you for your help in and outside the lab, and that, as expected, you have indeed made many great friends. Since you left Merlin already a while ago, the process of finishing the thesis while having a new job was not without struggle. Maybe even more than ever, you had to motivate yourself to keep going and take these final steps. And although I never doubted that you would make it, I am really, really happy to have seen you today showing what you have learned and done and defending your thesis like a true expert in almost everything related to bone regeneration. I really hope that you are happy now and proud of yourself. I wish for you to more often see the glass as half full rather than half empty, because you deserve it. You have everything in you to make you a fantastic scientist, and I'm sure you will do great, whether it is in academia or in industry or anywhere else. Just try to find a place where you feel happy. And I would also like to congratulate your parents, your other family, and friends outside the Netherlands. Felicitaciones. Pueden estar orgullosos de Víctor. It must have sounded horrible, but I did my best. Before I close, I would like to thank the committee members for thoroughly reading your thesis, giving their evaluation and discussing with you today. It is, of course, a pity that you are not in Maastricht today to have a celebration with your Merlin family, many of whom are undoubtedly online with us. But I hope you will turn this special day into a huge celebration in Spain. I wish you all the best.
Dear esteemed Víctor Pablo Galván Chacón. Dear Victor, it's my great pleasure to congratulate you with your doctorate and the honor that you have acquired today. I do that also on behalf of the Board of Deans of Maastricht University. And I now would like to share some impressions of the degree committee with you. We have seen an interesting and clear presentation. And your thesis we considered as of good quality, inspiring and original work, a nice blend of diversity of methodological approaches. And it's good science, it's well published, and not to forget, it's multidisciplinary. And we are very satisfied as well with your defense, with a flow of ideas, and you have shown to be very knowledgeable in your field. And I congratulate you with that, but I congratulate also your supervisor, Professor Pamela Habibovic, with this result in terms of a wonderful thesis and good publications and an excellent defense. I would like to include in my congratulations your parents and the other members of your family. And I also would like to include your friends and colleagues and all those who have contributed to your studies and in the end in the publication of your thesis and your defense today. And I wish you a successful professional career and a happy personal life. Before I close the ceremony, I would like to thank very much the members of the Thesis Assessment Committee and of this degree committee, and in particular the external members and all opponents for their questions and the interesting academic discussion that we had. I thank also the ICT supporter of this ceremony and the Dean and the Beadle of the PhD office for their input in this ceremony. And Maastricht University, I would like to say, appreciates your contributions. And hereby I close this academic ceremony.